Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Dugout podcast. How many episodes deep into this podcast are we at this point?
This is like the 23rd or 25th.
Oh, Lord. Hello, everyone.
Oh, we're here.
Today's episode is going to be really cool. Today is October 16th, and I believe it was yesterday in 1966 that the Black Panther Party was founded. So since we recently put out the Jonina Abram Irvin interview, we thought it'd be a good idea to talk more about the Black Panther Party. I think this will just be an intention on the podcast moving forward in general, just like picking different organizations or movements to kind of unpack. But today we want to talk about the Black Messiah. The Black Messiah. And who is that, Jordan?
Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton. I don't think his name's actually Frederick.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah. Fred Hampton, revolutionary.
And so, why were you interested in talking about him for this episode?
We just watched parts of like The Big Cigar, and when it comes to like the image of the Black Panther Party and who's really a star, Fred Hampton is really what comes to mind to me when it comes to like name recognition, when it comes to story recognition, and when it comes to like the kind of people that over glorify Huey is a different brand than the kind that over glorify Hampton. And I feel like I'm more respective to over glorify of Hampton for certain dynamics that I'm sure we're going to talk about. They're an inspiration to me. They're a part of a like legacy that is still around and that like we can still touch and feel. When you're in this work, you realize, oh, I'm only 2 to 3 degrees of separation from Fred Hampton Jr., who is like still actively doing like the Black Panther Party Cubs with their mom and comrades and other folks. So I think it's interesting to see and realize that like, oh, this is a legacy that like we're still actively building. And I think also as someone who was like getting in right when I turned 18 into like being way more active in movement spaces, and then knowing that like they died so young, like for me it was really something to turn 22 and be like, I outlived Fred Hampton, which is crazy, especially like through 2020 and 21 with like such vocal and visible unrest to Black Death. It meant a lot to still be able to see and interact with this kind of legacy.
There's a book called The Assassination of Fred Hampton, How the FBI and Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther by Jeffrey Haas, who I believe maybe was his lawyer, or at least that's the author.
Yeah.
But I wanted to read a bit from the first chapter where he talks about meeting Fred Hampton. And it's basically when Fred Hampton is giving a speech to a number of people, and Fred says, if you ever think about me and you ain't gonna do no revolutionary act, forget about me. I don't want myself on your mind if you're not going to work for the people. If you're asked to make a commitment at the age of 20 and you say, I don't want to make a commitment at the age of 20, only because of the reason I'm too young to die. I want to live a longer life, then you're dead already. You have to understand that people have to pay a price for peace. If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then damn it, you don't deserve to win. Let me say peace to you if you're willing to fight for it. And I think that's kind of like, in a lot of ways, I guess, sort of like a synthesis of kind of what you're saying, where it's like there's this romanticism of these figures and people have a set idea of them. But even Fred Hampton is saying here, like, don't think about me or romanticize me if you're not going to do this shit, which I think is a part of the whole historical co-optation. And you were even saying in researching this episode a little bit that you said you haven't seen that many podcast episodes out about him.
Yeah, that and like reading some books, there's like not that like talked about like the lack of actual scholarship specifically around Hampton. Like there's some scholarships and dissertations a lot about like the Illinois Black Panther Party, which is amazing. I think that like exploring their legacy isn't something that folks, I don't think people like actively avoid it or anything. I just think like the literature out is so limited. And especially when you think about how Fred Hampton Jr. and their mother, Mama Kuna, would talk about shutting down so many offers. Even when their gas boat was about to be shut off, they would shut down offers given to them to tell their story from folks that actually took that seriously, who were like, okay, if we don't have the blessing of the family, we're not going to do this project. That the actual amount of like anthropological studies on them are a lot more limited, and folks have been very protective about their legacy.
In this episode, we'll be talking about a few different things. We'll, of course, go through like a basic bio of Fred Hampton. We definitely want to dig more into his framework as an organizer, especially someone who organized extensively in his youth. Him and his friends, when they were younger, even did weekend breakfast giveaways in their neighborhoods. He was a part of the Youth NAACP, helped start the Rainbow Coalition eventually when he was sort of coming of age. But he definitely has like a strong background of organizing that we want to talk about that even precedes the party. And then also talk about a little bit about the circumstances around his assassination, COINTELPRO, and definitely the other organizations and folks that he was doing work with.
So as we were talking about, Fred Hampton was a dynamic leader, a revolutionary. They were born on August 30th in 1948 in the Chicago suburb of Argo, and from an early age, Hampton displayed natural talent for leadership, organizing classmates in high school to protest racial inequities and spearheading efforts for community improvement. By the age of 20, he became a prominent figure in the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, quickly rising to the position of chairman due to his charisma, powerful oratory, and commitment to grassroots activism. Hampton's vision extended beyond Black empowerment. He aimed to build solidarity across racial and class lines. This approach led to the form of the Rainbow Coalition in 1969. There's a multiracial analysis which included the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican activist group, and the Young Patriot Organization, a collection of poor white Southerners, alongside the Rise Up Angry, which is also another poor white organization in the Rainbow Coalition. And together they united against police brutality, substandard housing, systemic economic inequities, and demonstrating a revolutionary model of inter-community organizing. Hampton's work, however, made him a target of the COINTELPRO, the FBI counterintelligence program aimed at dismantling Black liberation movements. And on December 4th, 1969, at the age of 21, he was assassinated in a coordinated raid by Chicago police with federal involvement. Despite his tragic death at just 21 years old, Hampton's legacy continues to inspire movements for racial justice, solidarity, and systemic change. So from the research, we found out there was like two competing chapters of the Black Panther Party, and competing is a strong word. I don't really know too much about it. There was like a West Side and a South Side chapter. Eventually, Hampton got in cahoots with one of the chapters with Bobby Rush in it, but it wasn't the one that was like officially recognized yet until some of the West Coast Panthers came to Chicago, got in some trouble. They tried to call up the local party, but the officially recognized one didn't have a phone yet. But Hampton, Bobby Rush, and them folk all decided that it was important to have a phone first in an office. And they were working with a local church to make that happen. So they were able to get in contact with the West Coast Panthers when they were in trouble, and were able to make more connections like that. And eventually they merged into what became the Illinois Black Panther Party. But when they merged, that's when he became the chairman, and like folks became other secretary parts of it. What's it called? Coordinating committee.
Oh, yeah.
Of the organization. And I think it's important. You were talking earlier about his activism when he was younger. I mean, when he was in Provo East in the high school in Chicago, he was organizing. He was a part of one of the youth chapters, and they were talking about needing more Black administration inside of the schools, needing more Black teachers inside of the schools. Someone who ended up becoming a dean of Provo said that he was trying for 3 years to get that job, but then it wasn't until Fred and the other NAACP members started actually agitating and doing some organizing. They were leading walkouts until they actually saw some change and was able to get hired, even though he's been trying to get hired there for years and years. And I think it shows to like what they were talking about earlier of like, oh, you don't want to commit to the struggle because you're too young. And he knew there's no point in which you can deny the struggle around you. You're just going to ignore it and then be affected by it. Yeah. He struggled around it on top of, and he said, we need to throw our hands in the ring and into the fight and get down into the work. I mean, and this guy, he was wiretapped when he was 14. Because, COINTELPRO started in the 50s. They wanted to break down the Communist Party. They were doing all this groundwork and building up this rapport within the FBI of just information on folks in all these different types of cities. And this is how expansive the COINTELPRO was.
Yeah, and I think some other background that is interesting is that Fred Hampton's mother, I believe, when they were young, would babysit Emmett Till. And so basically Hampton's family and the Till family were like relative, like community and friends. And so in a lot of the research and reading that you do about Fred Hampton, it actually mentions it here on page 17 of The Assassination of Fred Hampton. It reads, 14 years after Emmett's murder, thousands of Chicagoans would walk through the same Rainier funeral home to see Fred's body displayed. Many thousands more would take the tour through the bullet-riddled apartment where Fred and Mark Clark were slain by the Chicago police. One of the neighborhood residents described the police raid as nothing but a northern lynching. Fred, Dee Dee, and I used to talk about Emmett, especially when we went south, Fred's brother Bill told me. My mother had told us Emmett had a funny lisp, like Fred when he was younger. We heard that it was his lisp, which sometimes came out like a whistle, that had cost Emmett his life. So I think, one, it's just interesting to think about Hampton through this lens of the cyclical nature of anti-Black violence, the cyclical nature of like white genocidal violence, and how even in his younger years, he had this mirror image of what death or mortality could look like for him. Kind of to some of the other things that you mentioned, like this book mentions that Fred was a really great student, that he cared about the social aspects of being in school. It even notes on page 17, Fred tape recorded and memorized the speeches of both Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. He visited Reverend Clay Evans Church on Drexel Avenue, where George Jackson and Operation Breadbasket and later Operation Push were headquartered and practiced these preachers' techniques. It's interesting because you could even see from a young perspective, that's kind of like, you sent me the podcast earlier for Judas and the Black Messiah. They have this podcast where they kind of unpack Fred's history. And in that podcast, they talk about how even from a very young age, he was just really fucking politically active. I mean, to organize in the school system, and it notes here on page 18, at Proviso East, Fred encountered inequalities that frustrated him. He recognized that the mostly white faculty and entirely white administration did not adequately prepare the Black students for the technological world around them. Black students doing poorly were either counseled out of school or flunked out. They had no remedial programs. He felt that many of the white teachers were tired of teaching and had stopped caring. Some used racial slurs when talking about Black students. Fred spoke out, demanding more Black teachers and Black administrators at the school. Charles Anderson, a former Proviso East dean, credited Fred's campaign to bring in more Black teachers and administration with him getting a job. Fred was the reason I was hired at Proviso East High School as dean in charge of attendance, he said. Until that time, I had been applying for 6 years and have never even been given an interview. Fred also believed that it was unfair that only white girls were nominated for homecoming queen, so he's here for the Black sisters.
And then they organized like a whole walkout about that. And even from when they were younger, we can't skip over the swimming pools stuff they did when they were younger, because I'm pretty sure that's what got COINTELPRO on him from the beginning. And that's something he fought for his whole life and didn't get until after he died. And they thought about naming it after somebody else. The community, about almost damn near rioted, said, no, this is going to be Fred Hampton's swimming pool. And a quote from The Assassination of Fred Hampton says, quote, Black militancy was on the rise in Chicago as well. In the fall of 1967, Fred and Bill Ivory, a much respected dentist and NAACP member, addressed a Maywood rally of over 100 young people. Fred urged his listeners to come to the Maywood Village Board meeting the next night to press their demands on a public swimming pool and recreational center. In the following evening, a large crowd, mostly young Blacks, went to Maywood Village Board meeting. Not all were allowed inside. Fred urged the board to find a larger space or let those outside come in, even if they had to stand. And the Maywood police panicked, tear-gassing the people who had not been let in. Angered at the police response, the young people left the village hall, ran down Fifth Avenue, Maywood's main street, and they broke store windows and threatened residents, including a Methodist minister, Ron Graham, and his wife. And a guest in their home was punched by one of the teenagers running from the police. Seeking a scapegoat, the Maywood police arrested and charged Fred and Bill Ivory with mob action because of their speeches of the night before. And even though they were inside the village hall when the violence took place, Fred stayed in jail for 3 days before he could post the $500 bail. This whole legacy of them as a youth, especially, I believe they were marching with with MLK when they would come to Chicago at that point when they were still in the youth NAACP. And at one point he was marching and he saw this young Black woman get spit on by a white outsider, and just kind of had this ruminating thought. And they said, I don't know how much longer I can do this nonviolent stuff. And it just makes me think of like this name of this book of this nonviolent stuff will get you killed. And I think about that often when it comes to talking about tactics and making those tactics a full strategy. To say that therefore the Illinois Black Panther parties weren't nonviolent in some of their tactics would be completely not true. Especially when it comes to the framing of how police crashes happen. Like, they always talk about how Black Panthers have guns to defend themselves, not to just ambush cops. So every time they say, oh, the cops or the Panthers ambush us, Panthers immediately know it's false. The cops had to have done something, or the Panthers wouldn't have reacted the way they did. And police, especially pigs at the time, and everybody knew it, as they do now, escalate the hell out of situations, especially if they think that you are, quote, dangerous. And which more dangerous in America than a young black man with a gun, legally or not, or a black woman, or a black non-binary person. We all out here.
Through high school, Fred Hampton was radicalized and would help radicalize other people when he was a part of the youth NAACP chapter. I was listening to the Judas and the Black Messiah podcast earlier, and they mentioned that in a 7-month period, Fred Hampton helped raise the membership of the youth NAACP chapter in Chicago from 7 to over 700 in a 7-month period. And I just think the middle of the 60s is interesting because you have the Black Panther Party, which was founded in 1966. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, which, as far as our research shows, is the same year that Fred Hampton joined the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. And all of this is interesting because I really do think about the fact that Fred Hampton was literally coming of age through all of these social conditions, through the civil rights movement, through the over-policing in Chicago, through the worsening conditions that many Black, brown, and poor people faced, and also the fact that the Vietnam War was happening, the draft was occurring, while poor Black and brown communities are experiencing all sorts of state-sanctioned violence. They're also being sent to other countries to commit imperialistic harm. And it's really also important to mention that in the assassination of Fred Hampton, they do mention that when he was younger, him and his friends would cook breakfast food on the weekends and then pass out weekend breakfasts. And so we can even see in his younger years a lot of the precursors for the things that he would do when he was in the Black Panther Party. And do we want to talk about like what his time in the Black Panther Party really meant, or what his particular impact was?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and he saw the Black Panther Party like kind of working around him when he was doing NAACP stuff, and like near the end of his time with the NAACP and the like burgeoning of the Black Panther Party locally. And yeah, like they saw that connection. They're like, well, oh, they have a breakfast program? Like that's something that's already on my mind. And like thinking about what kind of tactics and things they want to do to build political power for Black people and for poor people in Chicago. As soon as they saw that model, they realized they had to be a part of it. And a part of it they did become. They were recruited by Bobby Rush from the Black Panther Party in Chicago, which I believe was a part of, like, at the time, the South Side Black Panther Party. I mean, they were an orator, especially, I think, in the Black community. Like, in church folk, especially, it's like you have the gift. Like, you're an orator. Like, it's a very recognized thing of, like, you have to use your gift, go to preacher school usually. Like, that's usually how it's only, like, avenued. But this avenue of seeing this person with the gift and seeing them transcend politically in a more secular way is something that I think is also, like, very inspiring to me, too, because, like, it recognizes that, like, that's their role, especially as chairman, because, like, chairmen aren't supposed to have guns. They're just there to be the voice of what the whole party is talking about and doing. And there are other people who do other things in other parts, education, people who do security, people who do health, people who do all that kind of stuff. I mean, there was at one point, and while they were in the Black Panther Party, they were on live TV. They were arrested on live television. The police didn't handcuff him, which he immediately thought was weird. And then when he gets into the police car, like already arrested, mid-interview, there's a crowd. He realizes there's a gun in the back of this police cruiser with him. And he's like, they're trying to set him up. They're trying to kill him. So he reaches his hand out the window, or out of the car as much as he can. He's screaming, there's a gun in here, there's a gun in here. And I mean, people talk about how it took 643 ways that the CIA tried to kill Fidel Castro. And there were many, a plentitude of times they have tried to get Hampton from an early age. And I mean, that stuff was coming after a reaction to the Rainbow Coalition, which we're getting into, but... Just
to give more context about how Fred Hampton became involved with the party, in March of 1968, Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown came to Chicago, and they opened a SNCC office. Fred went to that office and invited Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture to speak in Maywood. A few weeks later, Kwame Ture actually did speak. H. Rap Brown and Kwame Ture were so impressed by Fred's introduction that they introduced themselves to him afterwards. And this was something that was kind of in the movie that I thought was interesting, that is also mentioned here in the text, The Assassination of Fred Hampton. Yeah, it mentions how Fred was very clear about approaching sexism and misogyny in the party. And here on page 39, it reads, early on, women in the party, including Joan McCarthy, Ann Campbell, Barbara Sankey, Joan Gray, Stephanie Fisher, Beverlina Powell, and Lita Harrison took the lead and did the majority of preparation for the breakfast program. Panther member Bradley Green said the women were the hardest and most effective workers in all the Panther programs. One Panther woman described being in the Panther office when the phone rang. The person who answered it walked over to Fred and said, "The brothers are here from the West Coast and they're staying at a hotel downtown. They want you to send some Panther sisters down there." Fred responded quickly and curtly, "You can tell them the Panther women in Chicago are working on Panther programs, not as whores for Panther leaders." Fred was 21 years old, the Panther's sister insisted. It took a lot of courage for him to stand up to the West Coast guys. A lot has been written about sexism and the role of women held in the 1960s and 70s activist groups. Kwame Ture's alleged statement, "The only position for women in SNCC is prone," has been widely quoted. It no doubt expressed some of the men's sentiments, but the women I've interviewed from the Chicago Panther chapter said that this was not the prevailing attitude in Chicago, nor was it Fred Hampton's. There were some guys always trying to come on to women, but they didn't do this when Fred was around. One former woman Panther told me. Another said, "It wasn't perfect, but we could have done more to elevate women, but feminism was just coming to the fore. We weren't immune from the sexism in the culture." I think this was something that was actually in the movie as well, and I always kind of wondered how accurate it was. And of course, there's a spectrum to how people react to like sexism, but I do think it is, to me, kind of endearing and beautiful that he respected the other people he was organizing with enough to the point that he would call out other men, because I feel like that's something that I especially think about when I read a lot of this history and literature, and like especially when we were doing our episode on Kwasi Balagoon, how there's so much kind of baked in sexism that is kind of assumed, and we don't really get many visions or examples of what it was like or how Black men stepped in and tried to advocate for the people around them. Some other things that Fred was known for, I mean, the Chicago chapter was definitely known for their variety of survival programs. One thing that they did was that they started a Panther Clinic in Chicago. This book, Assassination of Fred Hampton, notes Satchel, who started the Panther Clinic in Chicago, put it another way: "The Panthers were an armed propaganda unit that raised the contradictions, set the example, and provided the vehicle that people could ride to the revolution. We do not say that the Panther Party will be overthrowing the government. We heighten the contradictions so people can decide if they want to change the government." And it goes on to say, Fred urged the Panther members to sell increasing newspapers of the Black Panther newspaper throughout Chicago. The paper was printed weekly on the West Coast and divided to most major cities. Party members were given a sales quota.
It's interesting. The actual, the full name for that is the Spurgeon Jake People's Medical Care Center, named after a Panther who was martyred by the police in an interaction that left 2 police dead and 1 Panther dead. That was very, very important. Claiming the legacy of Panthers and not letting the state's narratives fully reign. I think that's seeing it a lot in this too. I mean, that's something they talked about in the movie as well. I mean, there's this moment right before the assassination. Everyone's talking about how to get into Algeria and other places. And he's just like, "You know how much money it would take to get me to Algiers? Like, we could be doing a health clinic. We could be doing all these other things in 5 years instead of spending it just on me. It's 5 years. I will survive." Did you know he didn't survive the night? I think that's like the attitude and approach that they wanted to kind of respect. It seems like this is one of the chapters, and I'm no fan of democratic centralism, but in which it definitely did play out in the favor of the organization. And I think it also leads into the point of where there's more literature on the whole Illinois chapter than just Fred Hampton themselves. 1, because Fred died so young, and 2, because there's that image and that legacy of it's not just about our chairman right now. It's really not. We need to be doing more. And then the intense repression that came in the 70s and 80s led to lots of different things. But I think it's very interesting kind of legacy on like how even folks archive and think about the Black Panther Party as like a community.
Play some of his speeches.
I'm the deputy chairman of the state of Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party's relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that word that they're refused a lot. And what we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we've said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people. And we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people. Everybody in the state of Illinois is going to have to be involved or even around the revolution because we're going to have one. We're going to have to do more than talk. We're going to have to do more than listen. We're going to even have to do more than learn. We're going to have to start practicing, and that's very hard. We're going to have to start learning, and you learn through practice. We're going to have to start making mistakes, and you learn through making mistakes. We're going to have to start getting out there with the people. And a lot of times we think we're better than the people, but that's an insult, and that's criminal. Think you're better than the people. We got to get together and learn where it's at. It's going to take a lot of hard work. Education for children is something else. You ought to dig on it. Every sister in this audience. Every sister in this audience ought to get themselves together and come on down and help us with that Breakfast for Children program. You ought to come down and help feed them children in the morning. We have Breakfast for Children because we teach the people through practice, through observation and participation, that people can be fed free. That's people thing. Socialism is the people. You're afraid of yourself. If you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself.
What do you think of that line? If you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself.
I think it's powerful. I think it gets people to really ask, what do I know about socialism? Are you afraid of learning? Are you just hearing a word and putting some scapegoat or some scarecrow onto it and just engaging in fallacy? Like, we really have to think about, these are just the things we do when we need to create something and have sustained control over it as people who are directly affected by the institutions that we create. And if you're scared of that, then you're scared to give yourself power. And if you're scared to give yourself power, why would you just give it to some other man? We need to be able to hold that power as a community. I think that's something that Fred really harps on. Because by the time they were 18, they identified as a third worldist. They were already reading Mao, they were already reading Garvey and all that jazz.
And I think that's what's interesting and necessary when looking at his lifetime and the lifetime of everyone coming of age then. It's like the Vietnam War was such a backdrop and it represented such an apparent evil. And you can look at most of the civil rights or Black Power documentaries and it's like, why are they sending us over there to kill Vietnamese people when our government can't even do what is necessary here to take care of us, to not brutalize us, to not treat us like dogs? Fred being very aware of other decolonial struggles and being aware of socialism and alternative models of governance, I think is like really fascinating and interesting, because what he really presents is like, you can't just be aesthetically about the revolution. There needs to be education. We can't just rely on nationalism. He was very much against a sort of, I don't know, like deeply politicized like nationalism that could be another way to sway people towards Black liberation. I think he was more interested in a sort of intercommunalism that wouldn't be based on nationhood, which I think is also something beautiful, because it's kind of a step past, I don't know, it's a step towards like the Black Power vision of things. And I don't know, and I think it's also interesting like semantically when he says like all power to all people, white power, black, like he has speeches where he says like white power, Black power, Chicano power, or whatever. And in context, it makes sense, but when I hear it, I'm like, oh, white power. But that's what I think is so beautiful, because even in our day and age, we can still look online or just look in communities and see that there are people that are invested in the aesthetics of a revolutionary process, and then there are people that are actually interested in like the day-by-day experimentation, showing up, doing work, gaining those resources, doing the kind of social things that are really necessary to be a part of a community. And it seemed like Fred, that's one of the reasons he was so successful, is because he was so tied to a political framework. He was disciplined, I guess is like another way to say it.
Here's a quote from Power Anywhere Where There's People. He said, quote, "We just got back from the South Side. We went out there and we got to arguing with the pigs, or the pigs got to arguing. Well, Chairman Fred, you're supposed to be so bad. Why don't you go and shoot some of those policemen? You're always talking about you got your guns and you got this. Why don't you go and shoot some of them?" And I said, quote, "You've just broken a rule. As a matter of fact, even though you have on a uniform, it doesn't make me any difference because I don't care if you got on a 9 uniforms and 100 badges. When you step outside of the realm of legality and into the realm of illegality, then I feel you should be arrested." And I told him, "You being what they call the law of entrapment, you tried to make me do something that was wrong. You encouraged me. You tried to incite me to shoot a pig. And that ain't cool, brother. You know the law, don't you?" And I told that pig, I told him, "You got a gun, pig. You got to put your hands up against the wall and we're going to do what they call a citizen's arrest." And this fool didn't know what that is. And I said, now, quote, "Now you just got to be as calm as you can and don't make too many quick moves because we don't want to have to hit you." We told him, "I'm here to protect you. Don't worry about a thing. I'm here for your benefit." So I sent another brother to call the pigs. You got to do that in a citizen's arrest. He called the pigs. Here they come talking about they're going to arrest Chairman Fred. And I said, "No, fool. This man's the man you got to arrest. He's the one that broke the law." And what did they do? They bugged their eyes. They couldn't stand it. You know what they did? They were so mad. They were so angry that they told me to leave. And what happened? All those people out there on 63rd Street, what did they do? They were looking there laughing and talking with me while I was making the arrest. They looked at me while I was rapping and heard me while I was rapping. So the next time the pig comes on 63rd Street, because of the things that our Minister of Defense calls observation and participation, that pig might be arrested by anybody. We're out there educating the people. How do we educate them? Basically, the way people learn is by observation and participation. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we got to do here in this community. I think that part right there is like a big part of what, at least like the ethos of the Black Panther Party was like use their rules against them as a tactic. Whether or not you agree, like I wouldn't agree, especially as an anarchist, about the legalistic language around it. But that's not what they're really trying to attack and center in this frame right now. They're attacking and framing the fact that to heighten the contradictions for regular people, you have to talk about the law, how they see it. And they see it and how they think about it is if you do something bad, you're a bad guy. Or you need to at least have some sort of accountability. And you can attack the contradiction of what is accountability and what do law enforcement actually play in our lives. And we all know it's not fucking accountability. And it still isn't. And I think it's very interesting when we talk about this language of contradictions. It's a very Marxist, it's a very Maoist kind of thing. And I do really appreciate this kind of language.
Approaching politics and changing material conditions through the lens of contradiction specifically does for Black people. I would argue in one way, it's a contradiction that we're even here. What does it mean to continue to exist through the contradiction of being brought to a land through a very real violence against your people, and then to be made to survive it? Like, I don't know, I guess I think about it in the most basic way in how what Fred Hampton was doing was literally giving away free food, offering free healthcare, free education, offering community protection. Basically, to some of what you're saying in terms of the state and accountability, these revolutionary organizations were doing the work that the state should be doing, but the state is committing violence. And then there's also the other contradiction of the Black Panther Party was trying to help people and COINTELPRO is trying to intervene to destroy something that is actually trying to help a community. To me, that seems like a sort of core contradiction in itself. The government are calling these people terrorists, but the government is actually the terrorist organization. And so all of the logic is through the lens of contradiction, and what Fred Hampton and these other revolutionaries were trying to do was to clarify that process and to just name it. And that's what I think is, maybe I'm also going too far ahead, but I'm thinking of like the contradiction of there being a Hollywood movie being made about Fred Hampton while Jay-Z is on this soundtrack. I don't know. And so it's, I guess through the lens of contradiction, I just find it to be really fascinating and necessary. Another way I can put it is I think in some organizing spaces, people are willing to accept certain contradictions and other people are not. And what are those series of contradictions that kind of, based on what you can accept, it places you in a particular revolutionary trajectory. And it seems like for Fred, the contradiction was like, the state isn't going to save us or help us at all, so let's just save ourselves. And how that was so matter of fact to him, but maybe to someone else, the logic might be like, oh, Black people just need to like try harder or learn more, or maybe if we just had our own schools, if we were our own nation. But that kind of solution involves its own contradiction or replication of these like already standing like fucked up social processes. But I really like the idea of confronting contradictions, because then if you look at like a Black community, you can look at the contradictions of like, oh, the men are supposed to lead, but men also commit a lot of the violence that happens in like Black homes or like the family life or the family structure. And what does it mean to have black men be at the lead, yet they are also excused from all these different forms of violence. And so you can look at like a lot of what Fred Hampton is doing and saying, and it is through that lens, because he is doing some of the harder work that's necessary to bring people together through those contradictions.
Yeah, and he wanted a socialist program. Like, everything about what bro was doing was for the end goal of communist revolution. He wanted there to be people-led, people-ran, and very bottom-up, I must say, socialist aspects. Whether or not that was prefiguratively done in the party, he ascribed to what is known as like a vanguardist approach. And they were one of those people, or at least they were a part of the group, and a lot of people considered and were aiming for the Black Panther Party to be the vanguard organization. But I mean, when you hear about how they talk, and they do talk about the Black Panther Party like that sometimes, but they also just talk about it's a vanguard movement that heightens these contradictions, and like to the point where people can't just sit by and watch these things that don't make sense to them, that the government around them is quote unquote supposed to be doing, when they realize like the real contradiction is you're expecting something of a government that doesn't want to serve you in the way that you want to be served. To do that, you would need a whole different government. We would need a socialist state. We would need the people power. These are these different things that get us to the state of governance that would actually be serving you like you're talking about as just a working person in Chicago, or like these kinds of things. And that was like the political dynamics that they were really approaching, that I think spoke to a lot of people too. Like, I mean, cause you just have that energy. Like, they were doing that while they were in the NAACP. I mean, you can't credit them for all, 630,000 extra people, but there's definitely something to be said about that infectious nature, especially of the socialist program. Cause I mean, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, it is infectious at times, especially if you have a good orator or someone who's not just trying to tell you, you should be a socialist.
Yeah, because it can't make sense, but if you have a bad orator, you're like, there's a contradiction here. Next, we're going to talk about how the Rainbow Coalition formed alongside the Chicago Black Panther Party chapter, and some of the background and history on that. We're going to read a little bit of an Oxygen article called "Who Was the Rainbow Coalition as Seen in Judas and the Black Messiah?" Hampton met Jose Chacha Jimenez, the founder of the Young Lords, in February of 1969. A Puerto Rican and Latino street gang that morphed into a civil rights organization, the Young Lords fought against evictions of Latino and poor families from the city's north side, as well as the increasing police abuses in their community. Shortly after the two met, they were arrested together while peacefully protesting at Wicker Park Welfare Office. Fred took the Young Lords under his wing. He gave us the skills that we need to come right out of the gang and start organizing the community, Cha-Cha said in a 2019 interview with Southside Weekly. We were already fighting for our rights in our neighborhoods, and we needed to form a united front. Our mission was self-determination for our barrios and all oppressed nations. It was a chance encounter that led the Young Patriots organization, a leftist organization of Chicago's mostly white migrants from Appalachia, into a coalition with the Black Panther Party and Young Lords. The YPO and a Black Panther Party leader were reportedly accidentally double booked to speak at the same Lincoln Park church on the same night. There, they began to discuss the similar experiences of poor white migrants on the city's north side and that of its black residents. Many in the YPO said they believed that they were considered dangerous by the city and were treated unjustly by the police, an experience all too familiar to the black Chicago residents. With this common ground found, the groups formed an alliance and the Rainbow Coalition was launched.
This movement towards unity and solidarity quickly caught on. In a matter of months, the coalition was joined by the Students for Democratic Society, the Pro-Chicano Brown Berets, the American Indian Movement, and the Chinese American Red Guard Party, among others. Through direct action, including strikes, protests, demonstrations, the coalition worked together to fight poverty, corruption, police brutality, and campaigning for housing justice. The coalition also worked to end violence between Chicago's street gangs by brokering non-aggression pacts. In May of '69, Hampton and the coalition managed to negotiate a truce between his group and the Blackstone Rangers and Black Disciple gangs. The truce was engineered as the FBI sought to stoke tension between the Rangers and the BPP and the Black Panther Party by forging a note that the Black Panthers had put on a hit on a Blackstone leader, Jeff Fort, as was revealed later in a Senate report. It was during this and after this Rainbow Coalition and working with the gangs in Chicago, which, like, the Blackstone Rangers and other gangs, like, they had a political bent to them already. So when it came to, I think in the movie, they're dramatized as the Combs or the Chris, or they give them some fake name in the movie when they have this interaction. But they were talking about, like, you're already doing this work. You're already feeding people. Like, the gangs were already feeding people. That's why they have this really funny line in the movie where they're like, man, the The Rangers pretty much, we feed more people than General Mills does. Fred Hampton's just like, imagine what we could be doing together then. Talk about just taking over the block. What about Chicago? And we don't have to stop there. And in his mind, he's talking about, listen, we already know what it takes to self-govern. You're doing that. What if we expanded the power of the people a bit more? And we really grew. And it wasn't just, especially, I can't remember the name of the mayor at the time, like Daley or something. He was really, really racist. So like they were really going up against a Democratic establishment that did not have their backs at all. And this coalition formed. I mean, this is when Hampton was then doing this interview and then was pulled out of the interview live, not handcuffed, thrown in the back of a police car with a gun, and they were going to shoot him. Or they were going to shoot him and claim that some shit had happened.
What I think is really interesting is that as the Rainbow Coalition was forming, it also kind of became very much to what this article was saying. These coalitions coming together really showed the state the power and capacity of these different groups coming together. And I think this is really why COINTELPRO kind of became even more prominent and necessary in the state's eyes, because it's literally in the documents of COINTELPRO. As all of this was happening, the FBI, the local police departments were trying to set all of these people up for failure. I mean, Fred was arrested and put into jail after being accused of stealing an ice cream truck and handing out free ice cream to people in his neighborhood.
Which is actually likely he wasn't even there for that. You know, like he actually probably had nothing to do with the ice cream caper. But that's what they were trying to get him on the biff for.
In the Rainbow Coalition, they tended to organize around a series of central issues. Police brutality was one of the most important ones. The Young Lords, for example, became more militant after the killing of one of their members, Manuel Ramos, by an off-duty cop. The coalition organized protests and directly confronted police actions to highlight the shared experiences of state violence across racial lines. They also organized around gentrification and housing rights. In neighborhoods like Lincoln Park, the coalition fought against gentrification that displaced working-class Puerto Ricans. The Young Lords occupied public buildings and disrupted development plans, using direct action to demand institutional support. Earlier, I was actually watching the documentary. It's called The Takeover. It's actually online, but it talks about how was it Chicago that the Young Lords took over, I think it was Lincoln Hospital, and they took over the hospital and continued it under better conditions. They made sure that people who were going into what Lincoln Hospital was known as at the time, the butcher shop.
Oh no, that was South Bronx and Lincoln.
Oh, Bronx, okay. Yeah, so the Young Lords did all sorts of really cool actions where they were taking over public buildings and institutions like the hospital that they took over in the South Bronx. And when I was watching the takeover earlier, it really made me think a lot about the student encampments in support of Palestine, and how watching these takeovers, it made me think about the intricate planning that they had to do in order to make these things possible, especially in the documentary The Takeover. They talked about how for a long period of time, the Young Lords would get to know people that worked at the hospitals to build relationships with them so they could make this takeover of the hospital more possible. And so even in the Young Lords kind of strategy, you can see a sort of shared social logic around, I guess in another sense, like exposing the contradictions through direct action. Like if the state owns a hospital and you go in and they do surgery on your left leg instead of your right leg, which wasn't supposed to happen, why does it have to get so bad to the point that the community has to step in? Like what kind of contradictions are being exposed there? And I even think about like the whole, like how the state is seen as the ultimate provider and protector when that already in itself is a lie that we're asked to accept, and how it's considered something radical to step in and intervene and stop state violence from happening.
Some people just think that that's not something a state should do at all.
Yeah.
Like it's just not a function of what even a government should be doing. There's a sentiment around anarchist politics and theory of change and around mutual aid will only get us so far. Like I'm about to talk some shit. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis have both said this. I mean, we heard this at the Socialism 2024 conference held by Haymarket. I heard it when I was there. It gets to the point of like, this is anarchist praxis. Like this is what you do when you're talking about bottom up socialism. And when people say, oh, do mutual aid, taking over the hospital, and they also, it was mainly to set up they set up a tuberculosis testing center in that hospital on the floor and improved the hospital during the short time that they took it over. People say organized mutual aid, and when I say it, I think it really does need to be like more expansive, and we should do an episode on this because about like how the takeover happened specifically, because that's it. We need to be organizing with nurses, with lawyers, with doctors, with all these trades and businesses that we think maybe unions or aren't unionized or don't have any sort of labor organized, and do the labor organizing. I'm not talking about just building unions. Sure, there can be a union, but we need to build relationships. They need to be a part, or at least aware of community organizations. Community organizations need to be inside and out doing this work, and that's mutual aid work. And that's how you get it through and build something that actually can sustain itself. So education centers, health centers, and these sorts of things can be ran by and for community members. That's when mutual aid actually does replace healthcare systems. That's when mutual aid can feed whole families consistently. And these direct aid programs that people are starting and doing all across here in the name of mutual aid need to be expanded, especially because doing them consistently leads to charity. It leads to burnout. It leads to these things that seem transactional, and it doesn't build power. It can build relationships, which is the foundation of a lot of power, especially socialist power, especially anarchist power. And that's what a lot of them are continuing to do, especially locally, but being able to continue them and understand that this is just the beginning of the beginning. When we're talking about what mutual aid is and can be, mutual aid is an economic system. It is not just an act that you do on the weekend. Yeah. And that's where it needs to be built, with internal and external rich relationships and friendships federated into what would then be called an economy. Like, that's what anarchists are talking about when we talk about building out mutual aid system. I do want to talk about this too, because there's been a lot of discourse. Just because I don't fully agree with Angela Davis and Ruth Gilmore and their tactics doesn't mean I don't read them, doesn't mean we're not a part of the same lineage. I don't think I want to get into that fully, but this is not like a complete diss or like a complete eradication. It's a lack of understanding in anarchist organizing itself that, like, when I talk to other like hardcore capitalist communists, I'm like, yeah, no, we need to address that. Like, this is not peak mutual aid.
It's an interesting critique, and even in relation to the Black Panther Party, it was interesting reading more about Hampton and hearing the discourse or the dissonance between the West Coast chapters and the East Coast chapters, and how I believe I was reading that the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, I believe, aligned a bit more with the East Coast. Is that what it was? Let me.
So no, it was like a cultural. I've heard Daruba Ben Wahad speaks a lot on this, especially around like the misnomers that people talk about.
Here it is in The Assassination of Fred Hampton on page 142. By 1971, the Panthers in Chicago and nationally had been diminished in size and influence. They weren't recruiting new members, and the Chicago chapter never regained the size it was before Fred's murder. No one could replace Fred's charisma, energy, and organizing ability. The Panther Party's primary activities became the selling of the Black Panther newspaper, the maintenance of the office on Madison Street, and the administering now diminished breakfast program in the health clinic. Many municipalities, including Chicago, began to implement their own free breakfast programs, taking away one of the Panthers' primal sources of community outreach and support. While the Panthers could rightfully claim they had initiated the breakfast programs, they received only the continued harassment from city officials who had copied them. Years later, with community pressure gone, the city abandoned the breakfast program. The split between most of the West Coast Panthers, including Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, who was living in exile in Algeria, took its toll on all the Panther chapters. Many Panthers left because they sympathized with Eldridge, who espoused the need for underground armed units. The Chicago chapter allied itself with the West Coast Panthers, who had given up much of their militancy. With their leadership constantly being arrested and put on trial, the West Coast Panthers devoted most of their time to freeing them. So I guess this kind of is after Fred's lifetime. I'm personally kind of interested in like those distinctions between the parties and how I could imagine mutual aid being seen as like less sexy or interesting or serious. But I guess I just keep thinking of that one poster I saw where it's like, the real anarchists do the dishes. Even the gender division of social work, political work, revolutionary work, and how could it be theorized that maybe one of the reasons that the Black Panther Party declined is that in its earlier years, men were way more militant and visible and willing to become heroes or symbols of the party. And while these men were gone and incarcerated, the women stayed and continued the work and continued the survival programs. And then when some of these high-profile men came back into the picture, a deeper kind of militancy became more important depending on the chapter that you're in. And so I guess I'm also just thinking about it through the lens of gender and how so many women propped up the party and were a part of these mutual aid systems. And somehow that life-giving work was somehow considered less revolutionary or central or as interesting to many people. Because there was even that one scene in Judas and the Black Messiah where I think there's some black dude that's angry that he has to like serve breakfast or something. And I'm like, isn't the most revolutionary thing to help the youth?
I'm very curious about, like, when it comes to that movie, how much that was happening at the same time. And, like, there was definitely some divisions, but it seems like it was, like, and maybe it was, like, the West Coast was losing that militant edge, that radical armed edge, and, like, dealing with the consequences of that. And folks were like, we need to be dealing with more community. Especially because Huey was saying in that moment, like, Eldridge put me in this picture with a gun. I don't want this to be my most iconic image. I want it to be here with these kids. We're all singing Panther songs, revolutionary edicts, and next thing you know, people are popping off and complaining about, like, we're not doing this no more. We're not really about revolution. And I guess that was because even, what was it? Was it Bobby or who was it? Algiers. They ended up talking and complaining over the phone on live TV. Was that Eldridge? That was Eldridge, yeah. Eldridge is complaining about, oh, I'm in Algiers where the real fight is, or the fighters, and you're over there in your Hampton thing and secluding yourself from the people, and like so many things going on. I'm surprised by the dichotomy of it because in my head, studying all this, they are all one and the same. And we are armed to defend not only our lives, but the autonomous institutions that we create. Out of the 13 free health clinics, only one of them still operates right now that were created. And I mean, that can do a lot of pressure, especially after COINTELPRO, parties dissolving, and just like the general repression and scene of politics at the time, it just wasn't sustainable I mean, one of them I think got federal funding. And I think it was able to become freestanding.
Next, I think it's important to talk about, obviously one of the biggest reasons that Fred Hampton is such a figure is that he was murdered at such a young age. And I will read a little bit of the account of his assassination in The Assassination of Fred Hampton from page 237. The Chicago FBI worked closely with local law enforcement, mostly through the offices of Edward V. Hannaran, who was elected Cook County's state attorney in November 1968. Hannaran created a special prosecutions unit, putting Assistant State Attorneys Richard Jalovec in charge. Starting in April 1969, FBI Special Agent Mitchell worked closely with Jalovec to target the Panthers. That June, as the FBI began coordinating raids on the Chicago Panther offices, a special squad of 9 Chicago police officers were assigned to report directly to the Special Prosecutions Unit, which in turn was closely working with the FBI Racial Matters Squad. On the night of November 13th, FBI Special Agent Mitchell met with informant William O'Neill and showed him photos of the 2 dead police officers killed earlier that day by Spurgeon Winters. In a series of meetings in the following days, Mitchell had O'Neill help map out the exact layout of Hampton's apartment, including the specific location of his bed and nightstand. He also asked O'Neill to keep tabs on who was coming and going from the apartment and to determine what weapons were kept there. Armed with this information, a raiding party of 14 SPU officers arrived outside of Hampton's apartment at 4:30 a.m. on December 4th. They did not bring the standard raiding equipment they had used in previous Chicago Panther raids, such as tear gas or sound equipment. Instead, they carried a Thompson submachine gun, 5 shotguns, a carbine, 1938 caliber pistols, and 1 .357 caliber pistol. The assault was quick and decisive. Within 15 minutes, Fred Hampton was dead, shot twice through the head while he lay in bed. Peoria, Illinois, Panther leader Mark Clark, in Chicago attending a statewide meeting of the Panther leaders, was also dead. The 7 other Panthers in the apartment, 4 with bullet wounds, were arrested on charges of attempted murder, aggravated battery, and unlawful use of weapons. 1 SPU officer was shot in the leg. Hannaran told the press that the Panthers fired first and continued to shoot repeatedly despite warnings from the police that they were at the door. The immediate violent criminal reaction of the occupants in the shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party. So does their refusal to cease firing at the police officers when urged to do several times. And this history to me is really important. I mean, there's different accounts of how William O'Neill was a part of this assassination. Some people say that there was a sleeping drug found in Fred Hampton's system when an autopsy was done on his body. And it's assumed that William O'Neill probably slipped this into whatever he drank that night. And I also think it's especially interesting how the Black Panther Party reacted after Fred's assassination by offering tours of community members being able to go into the apartment and see it, look at the carnage of the scene for themselves, and to be like, does this look like an apartment that people inside of it were shooting outside of, or does it look like there were just a shit ton of bullet holes and bullet fragments going into this space? It seems like from all the tours that people did, people could just go there and look and be like, this was a fucking state-sanctioned murder. It's interesting, even if you look at it from that historical perspective, how it was mentioned earlier, Fred Hampton's family knew Emmett Till's family. Like, Emmett Till's mother had an open casket funeral. And so even in the way that Fred Hampton was martyred, it still kind of begs the question of what is the utility of anti-Black violence and Black death if we literally need to have visible proof in order for it to have an impact beyond us or to reverberate for generations to come. And so I think it's just like a very interesting and sad an intense correlation. I mean, and that's why he's so well known, because anyone in the Black community can look at what happened and be like, they fucking went in and they knew that they were going to kill him. Even like the fact that they didn't bring their typical raiding equipment, like leave no witnesses.
When it comes to autopsy and everything, there's so many reports. And when it comes to the forensics of, they pulled him out of the bed, he was limp. They say, we think he's dead. And they shoot him 2 times point blank in the head. Now he's dead, is what they say. This was a lynching. This was an assassination. This was how the form of lynching has changed over time, especially for political figures. They didn't want this to be known. They went to the point of filming their own cover-up video, in which you can clearly see the officers looking for direction from the director on how they allegedly had already moved that day to make sure that they kept their story straight for something. Even, the Black Police Union came out and said Hampton was murdered, like the night before the actual city had an official press conference on this. And I think that whole dynamic shows the play of how bold and brazen this assassination was, and extremely traumatic. It's on screen, which was very difficult to watch. And there's an interview that days later after the assassination, Akira Najiri, formerly known as Deborah Johnson, they were never married, but his widow, recalls the events. And it's very harrowing, especially to listen to Najiri talk about it is like, it brings me to tears a lot and just like brings a pit to my stomach. Especially, as I described, I don't really want to get into it, but it's, the whole incident itself, like, definitely brought a lot of emotions out. And the fact that, like, the police didn't cordon off it as a crime zone, and that's why the Black Panther Party was immediately able to do the house shows and let people see for themselves. Like, you see all these bullet holes in one side and only a couple coming out one side. Looks like a massacre. It looks like a massacre just from the scene.
What do we think are some major takeaways that organizers today, revolutionaries today, can take away from the life and work of Fred Hampton?
There's a quote from him that I want to talk about. It says, quote, "If you say, quote, I'm on the independence ticket, that don't mean nothing. Democrat means you sell out Democrats. Republicans mean you sell out Republicans. Independent means you're out for a graft and you'll sell out to the highest bidder." End quote. And he goes on to talk about this way about elections, and especially around politics, and how they understand that, like, through building community bonds, relationships, and institutions, and that's a way in which you keep people into a revolutionary scene, vigor, and vibe, is just having these community programs. It's not just about being on the block with your gun. We've had that for forever. That doesn't lead to liberation, but what does is being on the block and being able to resist and being able to envision together and collectively. And I think that part of Hampton's legacy and, like, the real commitment and, like you were saying, discipline is something that I think should be studied, and if not studied, aspired to.
When I read more about Fred Hampton, I think about Huey P. Newton's notion of revolutionary suicide, and how, in some ways, I think the case could be made that Fred Hampton is a more conscious iteration of Huey P. Newton's version of revolutionary suicide. Hampton was locked up. He was a movement leader. But in some ways, I kind of get the sense that he really was about trying to organize for and with the people as much as he could. And I think some of that was just like him not being literally a co-founder of the party. Some of that was the fact that he was tied to other political organizations before he joined the Black Panther Party. Some of that was about his sort of very visible and direct intercommunalism, and how all of those things, I think, made him more accessible to his community, probably made him someone that people revered, in a lot of ways rightfully so, and how, I don't know, even in the film Judas and the Black Messiah, not to say like it's the most accurate depiction of what happened, but it showed his partner kind of questioning his dedication to the movement, and how there's a scene where she says like, I am in this movement because I believe it's the right thing to do, but how can we raise a child in this? And I think about the fact that Fred Hampton Jr., like I know he's spoken a lot in a lot of different spaces, and he said numerous times like, I was born with the government's gun to my head. And I think about like the notion of revolutionary suicide through the lens of like, I don't know, what's the Afro-pessimist phrase for like, we're already born dead or something, like an epistemological, almost like a manifestation of the Afro-pessimistic notion of an ontological death. And so I guess I think about it through that sort of political spiritual lens. And then I just think about the scope of state power and repression and the fallibility of leaders, and how I think one of the things that I think a lot of anarchist movements try to work towards theoretically is being non-hierarchical, engaging in direct action spaces, engaging in political organizing structures that make it less possible for the state to identify particular people as leaders and then to pick them off. And I think Fred Hampton unfortunately became one of these many clear historical examples where we can see this is someone who did amazing work, a lot of people loved, cared for. He basically innovated all these different formations of how to seek liberation and self-determination. And because of that and his heightened visibility, he became a symbol of the movement and a target for the state. I guess it just kind of makes me question the needed history of the Black Panther Party, but from a sort of retrospective, how their hierarchical nature, in a sense, did make it more easy for the state to map them, and how that, among many things, was kind of the downfall of the party in a lot of ways, or one of the many things that led to their downfall. And then I think about the fact that movements today have contemporary martyrs. I mean, we live in Ohio, where really well-known activist here, Marshawn McCarroll, unalived himself on the State House steps. Other people have gone missing. And so I guess I just think about the question of, I had this question a lot when I was in my early 20s. It was always the question of like, where does all of this lead us? Where do we go from here? What is next in the movement? And I think I'm grateful to have a life in existence where I can begin to be asking myself those questions now, beyond the mortality of what these movement spaces and these liberation struggles can represent. It just makes me think about all of those things. And I mean, he was so young, 21 years old, which is fucking wild to think about.
I mean, I think a lot of what you're talking about is, I think about another Black Panther Party member who was actually on the West Coast, Don Cox. And in his books, Just Another Nigger, he wrote about democratic centralism, a very important idea of how the Black Panther Party organized, especially as like in the vein of being a Marxist Lenin Maoist organization, and that being like an informative part of their socialism. Don Cox kind of reflects on democratic centralism and its inability to sustain leadership or leaderful activism within the party structure. And in their book, they say, quote, in some form or fashion, they must devise checks and balances, and he's talking about progressive organizations, to control the madness that seems to arise whenever power is concentrated in the hands of the few individuals. Democratic centralism is not the answer. It is a mechanism that gave us Stalin and Hilliard. Inevitably, when this form of organizational structure is adopted, centralism is emphasized, often to the detriment of democracy, and that leads to authoritarianism, bureaucracy, and dictatorship. And then he goes on to say, quote, after Newton's imprisonment and Kleber's exile, we began to study Marxist-Leninism to arm ourselves with an analytical tool to help us deal with the situation we were confronted with. At that point, it was David Hilliard who exhibited the most skillful capacity for articulating and manipulating the new language we were learning. He was chief of staff and a high-ranking member of the Central Committee, and also free and available to make decisions on a day-to-day basis. The combination of those factors, plus the party structure of so-called democratic centralism, but in the way that only centralism part was only implemented, plus Hilliard's infatuation with Stalin, plus Newton's support of this order of things upon his release created the malignant combination that led to the destruction of the Black Panther Party. He goes on to talk about how, of course, the state weakened the Black Panther Party, but also how they organized. And when it comes to even seeing a more democratic version of democratic centralism in the Midwest in the Chicago chapter, we're still seeing, once these leaders are no longer available, what does the party really have? I mean, even in the movie, they talk about him going to jail, party took a hit. So especially when we're talking about like the media and the image of it, he was a component that led to a lot of intake for not only the Black Panther Party, but like their whole life, which I just kind of think is an interesting dynamic. But also I think it's the fallibility of like permanent leadership, or leadership that's just, it's there to serve a purpose, but like they don't ever recognize the fact that leadership needs to change. And like the progression and changing of leadership is just as important to democracy than just having representatives. That's something that just as people aiming for more libertarian or democratic or whatever fucking word you want to use to make us more of a better and just society and have more consensus-based agreements around the institutions around us, these are the kind of questions and contradictions, one could say, that we need to really look at. And I do think that when it comes to coalition building and building federations, like they had an organizing history. They got to be a rank and file member in organizations and grow their way up. And not to do this whole great man history thing, but like what was cut short with the life of Fred Hampton was something that like we'll never know, but it was absolutely something lost when it comes to the energy in the Midwest around this kind of stuff. But I don't know how much they were like training other people to be orators, because they were always doing that political education. I mean, that was like a big part. You had to do your 6 weeks of political education, which is why it's always funny for me when I read Don Cox's thing and it's like, oh, some of these people in leadership had just started reading this ML stuff. Like, I thought that was part of the intro. I think it's a very interesting question that because I'm not an anarchist, I don't think all leaders or leadership as a idea or as a praxis is inherently terrible. But I do think it's like that same approach to power about anarchism that I appreciate and love as a foundation for my anti-authoritarianism and for my socialism is if we have, like, the classification of a leader cannot be so dim and so narrow that it's just those who people already in power think will be useful. Mm-hmm. It has to be like rank and file folks choosing and actively being a part of creating the leadership and creating the administration of an entity that they're in. And I think that's the beauty of anarchist philosophy is you take the power and you force it up, or you force it as up as it needs to go. I mean, how much do we need to centralize power in any certain types of ways? We really don't have to most of the time. And delegating and administration stuff does not mean you have to centralize power. And there are ways to have checks and balances around that. And as Don Cox was saying, we learned through the Black Panther Party that democratic centralism only gets you so far. And one thing I'm sick and fucking tired of seeing is just Black Panther Party dupes organizations.
This was another great episode. I'm glad we took the time and space to talk about Fred Hampton. And for folks that want to learn more about the Black Panther Party, check out our other episodes that feature a lot of info about the Black Panther Party, including our Judas and the Black Messiah review, where we talk a lot about other aspects of Fred Hampton's life. Also, our recent episode with Jonina Abern-Irvin, and stay tuned for more.
I can also highly recommend the Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff podcast if you want to learn some more history around the Young Lords, want to learn some more history about the Black Panther Party, and even some of the Black radical tradition that inspired them, like the Deacons of Defense and other NAACP folks that decided, hey, we need to be doing something on top of this. And it was usually armed. And they were usually shooting the KKK. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe. Stay dangerous. And if you're listening, you better be a part of the revolution.